I'm also going to really encourage not just questions in this session. You know, usually in a session, somebody starts, usually people have a preamble to their question, and somebody from the audience will yell out, "Question!" meaning, "What's your question? Please don't talk." Because of the subject matter here, I'm actually going to invite you to talk, even as I hope you'll be mindful that we do have a limited amount of time. Because, you know, frankly, a lot of times questions are really statements anyway. So I thought we would just be upfront about what a statement is. So my name's Anna Deavere Smith, and let me just say a little bit about why this particular panel is so very, very important to me. For those of you who've been here to Aspen, the Aspen Institute before, and if you've come to panels that I've done, then you probably identify me with the arts track. And I'm kind of off my beat for this panel and a couple of, and something I'm going to do later with Taylor Branch, who I see is here, along with Mrs. Branch, and I hope you'll come to that too. But what happened here was I was here in the winter time, and Kitty Boone said to me, you know, we do all this stuff on values, and we never do anything on right and wrong. Right? And so I had just come from a very amazing experience as an artist in residence at Grace Cathedral in San Francisco, where Dean Shaw presides. And I said, well, you know, we talk here about values-based leadership, and the experience I just had tells me that even though many people will say, if you ask them, are you religious or do you believe in God, they'll say, well, I'm spiritual, but I'm not religious. And, you know, we think of religion, some of us, not all of us, as a kind of a taboo. And yet it is a place where we tackle with and think about values. It's a place where many of our most profound myths have come from. One of the things that was so exciting to me about being at Grace Cathedral was that Dean Shaw feels that cathedrals need to be a place now, especially now, where we can have art, create art, produce art, and also a space where, especially now, that so many universities and schools have become vocational, that we can really explore meaning. And so I felt that it would be a wonderful thing to do here, to have us just point blank look at religion as a place where we tackle with our values. And added to that, this last year was the first time that I read Elaine Pagels' work. That had a huge effect on me. And the first time that I went to Israel, and that had a huge effect on me. So I thank you for coming today, and I hope that you all will share some of your experiences. So let me stop on my talk and say that what we're going to look at, the title is What Sustains Us, but a very important part of the title is
Religion.
Religion. Religion. What's the subtitle? Does anybody remember?
Religion as a source of values?
Religion as a source of values. So that's what it is. And let me introduce, everybody's going to speak for just 3 minutes, which is very brief for the particular 4 people up here with me, exceedingly brief. They're going to speak for 3 minutes, and then they will talk among themselves, and then we will open it up for your statements. And then we will come back and say some more things. So I'm just going to go down the line and introduce everyone to you. Elaine Pagels, her recent book, Revelations, Visions, Prophecy, and Politics, in the Book of Revelation, landed on the New York Times bestseller list this year, and in Newsweek was compared to the same zeitgeist as In Cold Blood by Truman Capote in its day. She is best known for The Gnostic Gospels, which won a National Book Award, the National Book Critics Circle Award, and was named one of the best 100 English language nonfiction books of the 20th century by the Modern Library. That book spawned 1 million biblical conspiracy theories, as well as the novel The Da Vinci Code. Other books include the New York Times bestseller Beyond Belief, The Secret Gospel of Thomas, Judas, The Gospel of Judas and the Shaping of Christianity. She is Harrington Spear Payne Professor of Religion at Princeton. Among her many honors is that she is a recipient of the MacArthur Fellowship. She's on the board of the Aspen Institute, and when I am so much of a heathen as to drop her name, people say to me, "You know her?" Diana Eck is a professor of comparative religion and Indian studies, and Frederick Wortham Professor of Law and Psychiatry and Society at Harvard University. She's recently been named at Harvard College Professor in recognition of named at Harvard College Professor in recognition of her teaching with Harvard College undergraduates, along with her partner, the Reverend Dorothy Austin, who is here today. She is Master of Lowell House, one of Harvard's 12 undergraduate residential houses. Professor Eck's academic work moves between India and America. About India, her work includes Benares, City of Light, and Darsan, Seeing the Divine Image in India, A Sacred Geography. Among other books, she has written A New Religious America, How a Christian Country has become the world's most religiously diverse nation, Encountering God, a Spiritual Journey from Bozeman to Benares. Her work on America began with the Pluralism Project, which she launched in 1991. Please note, that's 10 years before September 11th, as we call it, to explore the new religious diversity of the United States and its meaning for the American pluralist experiment. For 20 years, the Pluralism Project has been documenting the growing presence of the Muslim, Buddhist, Hindu, pagan, Sikh, Jain, and Zoroastrian communities in the United States. In 1998, Professor Eck received the National Humanities Medal from President Clinton and the National Endowment for the Humanities for her work on religious pluralism in America. Rabbi Stephen Lader currently serves as the senior rabbi of Wilshire Boulevard Temple, a large and prestigious synagogue in Los Angeles with 3 campuses and 2,500 families. He told me yesterday that if there was a mega church in the land of synagogues, he would be it. He is the author of The Extraordinary Nature of Ordinary Things and also More Money Than God, Living a Rich Life Without Losing Your Soul. Rabbi later contributed a chapter in Charles Barkley's recent book on racism in America entitled Who's Afraid of a Large Black Man? In his chapter, Rabbi later discusses the connections between economics, religion, and racism. He's currently heading a $150 million capital campaign to restore Wilshire Boulevard Temple's historic sanctuary and to develop an entire city block now owned by the temple, which is in the heart of Los Angeles. We are not passing the hat for you today. The bio he sent me ends as follows. Most important of all, he is married to Betsy and the father of Aaron and Hannah. He is also a Jew who likes to fish. Go figure. I'm quoting. Jane Shaw. The Very Reverend Jane Shaw is Dean of Grace Cathedral in San Francisco, an Episcopal cathedral. One of 3 major cathedrals in America, joining the National Cathedral in Washington and St. John the Divine in New York. Dr. Shaw joined Grace Cathedral from the University of Oxford, where she was Dean of Divinity and Fellow of New College, Oxford, and taught history and theology at Oxford for 16 years. She's also a canon theologian of Salisbury Cathedral and an honorary canon of Christ Church Cathedral, Oxford, and has served as theological consultant to the Church of England House of Bishops. She is a fellow at the Society of St. John the Evangelist, an Anglican monastic community in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Her books include Miracles in Enlightenment England, Octavia, Daughter of God, and a small volume, A Practical Christianity, Meditations on the Season of Lent, which is really just a beautiful book about opening your heart, and I think ultimately about love that I personally highly recommend. She grew up in a community in England that was founded in 1249. Where almost everybody who lived there was over the age of 65. Her siblings were much older than she, so she knew no children until she went to school. Her father was master of this community, which would now be kind of like a retirement home. There were cloisters in the chapel, and so it makes sense that she became a historian and a theologian. Would you please welcome this panel to the Aspen community? Dr. Pagels.
Well, it's a great topic, and I thought I'd start what sustains us with a value I feel strongly about. Maybe it's the most basic value we have as Americans, which Thomas Jefferson wrote into the Declaration of Independence. You know it. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. That is the conviction that every human life has intrinsic value. And it reminded me that when I first came to Aspen, I was in a seminar on human rights. And the moderator said, oh, well, you study cultural history, so tell us, what's the background of human rights? Why don't you go back to our Aspen favorites, you know, Aristotle and Plato. So I went to Aristotle, and I realized that what Aristotle said was exactly the opposite, that humans are innately unequal. Some are born naturally strong and powerful, and others are naturally weak and inferior. And that, of course, is why men, and Greek men in particular, rightly rule over women, slaves, and barbarians. And Plato was no help at all, because Plato valued, most of all, as you know, the republic. I mean, the word in Greek for individual is idiotes, from which we get the word idiot. So you get an idea of how much individuals were worth. And he certainly agreed, apparently, that the life and liberty of a single person, including Socrates, mattered less than the laws of Athens, which condemned him to death. So Jefferson, as you know, detested irrationality in religion, so much that he cut stories of miracles out of his own Bible. But he still realized that the value he was staking his life on came out of the ancient Hebrew creation story. And I want to talk just for a minute about creation stories, because he used the language of that creation story to say that human beings created in the image of God were endowed by their Creator and so forth with these rights. Now, you know, he didn't believe that story literally. He probably would have called it a myth. But he knew it wasn't just a superstitious, silly old story, and he knew it wasn't just bad science. Because it's often in those ancient creation traditions, creation stories and other religious traditions, what they do is they are encoded stories that communicate values basic to the culture. And Jefferson realized that those values communicated in that story have very practical implications. For him, it meant justifying revolution and starting a new government. Although, as you know, he stopped far short of respecting the life and liberty of African slaves. But still, there's one primary source of our values are these ancient religious traditions, often creation stories. I happen to like them. And they're written by people who tell stories about creation because they want to say, the values I'm telling you about are actually built into the structure of universe. They're kind of built into the DNA. Now, when you think historically, and certainly multiculturally, as Diana Eck is going to help us do, you realize that these Western values are not universal, and they're not timeless. They're very much bound to the cultures that produce those traditions. So while we affirm some of these values, or we might, we recognize that there are also other values encoded in those same ancient Hebrew stories that Jews, Christians, and Muslims share that often clash. Just one obvious example, because I just have 30 seconds left, I think. One obvious example is that the issue today of gay marriage pits people who want to take the sexual values articulated in the story of Adam and Eve and say we have to stick with them the way they were told thousands of years ago, pits that against people who claim that human rights trumps those ancient values articulated in the story of Adam and Eve. And so that's just one example. And so I just wanted to say that since we live in a multicultural world, we have to now think about those traditional values. I happen to think there are some of them maybe we could drop, some of them we might have to revise, and some of them that we'll wholeheartedly endorse.
Great. Professor Eck.
Thank you. I have to say this is my first time to Aspen. Delighted to be here. And I grew up in a place not so unlike this, in Bozeman, Montana, in the mountains, in a high mountain valley, and in a very strong Protestant United Methodist social gospel church, in which the values that were passed to me in so many ways were the values of love, of justice, and of community built on mutual respect. And those were the values that's my base camp, really, you have to say. I went to college, and during that time, this was in the 60s, in the Vietnam War, we knew almost nothing about Asia, though we were, a lot of us, deeply involved in Asia. So I launched out on a college year in India program and spent my junior year in Benares, India. And there I also met people who were involved in religious communities, deeply embedded in religious communities with their values as Hindus, as Muslims, as Sikhs. And I began to realize that their hospitality toward me, their sense of community was also something that was enormously enriching to me. So that question of how we live and think about our own deepest values in relation to religious difference, because religious difference is a fact of our world, that became a kind of driving question for me. And of course, after 1965, you know, the Immigration and Nationalities Act was passed. It was passed, by the way, in tandem with the Voting Rights Act, with the Civil Rights Act, all of them part of the effort to remove institutional racism from our society, and it had been embedded in our immigration codes as well. So our own landscape began to change, and there we were with Hindu neighbors who were not just my friends across the world, but across the street, Muslims in my classes, colleagues from every religious tradition and none, and the issue of religious difference became our issue here in the United States of America. So when we say, what sustains us, I want to say, well, who is the we in that us? I mean, there are lots of we's. There are the we's who are part of a particular Christian community or particular Hindu community. There's also we, the people of the United States of America, which is a much more complex we than we ever had before. And grappling with that has, if you know, certainly become one of the great contestations of our time in America. What does it mean that we have Muslim Americans organizing to get out the vote, that we have Sikh Americans litigating for their civil rights and human rights, that we have Hindu Americans who have basically imported their deities with green cards and citizenship into the suburbs of Boston? So these are our questions. They're certainly my questions.
Thank you. Rabbi.
I'll begin with a story. I was meeting with a billionaire, and none of the ones in the room today, to ask him to support an effort to build a very important center in the heart of Los Angeles for our congregation and for the Jewish community and for the larger community. The most ambitious project in American Jewish history, I would say. And his answer to me was this: well, Rabbi, I am Jewish, but my religion is peace, love, and understanding, and my temple is the world. Now, by the way, he happens to be a great guy who does a lot of good in the world. This is what I said to him. Let's call him Peter. I said, Peter, that's my religion too. You may not realize it, but every single decent thing that you believe in, treating another person the way you would like to be treated, being an ethical business person, being a good son, reaching out to protect the widow, the stranger, the orphan, the powerless in society, feeding the hungry, caring for the sick, caring for the earth, not gossiping, humility, kindness, peace, love, and understanding. Every decent thing you believe in comes directly from the Torah. You just don't know it. And this is what concerns me. We can get away with holding fast to and perpetuating our most sacred values in Western civilization for a generation or two or three or four. I don't know how many. But at a certain point, if you sever the values from the vehicle that has transported those values through history, then what you have essentially is a cut flower in a vase, which will look very beautiful, perhaps for a generation, 2, 3, or 4, but eventually this cut flower will wither and die if it doesn't have a root structure to sustain it. And this is the mistake I think my billionaire friend was making. My response to people who say that they're spiritual but not religious because they don't believe in organized religion is, well, what would you prefer? Disorganized religion? Would you prefer your phone call not get returned? Would you prefer there be no institution, no synagogue, no church, no mosque to help you when your life falls apart, to create order and meaning out of this chaos? Is that what you would prefer? I cannot tell you how many times, and I've never done this because it would probably be professional suicide, but how many times people have said to me, you know, Rabbi, I'm not religious, but I feel Jewish, and that's the main thing. And just once, I would love to say, you know, I didn't go to medical school, but I feel like a neurosurgeon. Now, why don't you lie down and let's get started? And I don't mean to say that feelings are unimportant. Of course they're important. But so is knowledge and behavior, because it is this prescribed set of behaviors that ultimately is the vehicle that carries our values forward generation to generation. Now, the rub, of course, is that religious discourse is often defined by the extremists in our country and in the world. The exception has become the rule. And this is as much the fault of the religious center and left as it is the fundamentalists, by the way. Because we, the center and the left, we have to take back that discourse. Because imperfect as it is, and it is imperfect, we have many problems in religious institutional life. We have terribly, terribly weak clergy coming out of our seminaries. We have not responded as synagogues, churches, and mosques to the kind of volitional environment that America presents, the kind of a la carte environment that this next generation has. They're not interested in buying the whole album. They just want a track or two, and that's just fine. So we haven't responded very well. We are too boring. We are living too much in the 20th and 19th century. But nevertheless, I am committed to betting on our religious institutions to carry these values forward because of the alternative. I am not willing to bet on the public school system to do that. I'm not willing to bet on professional sports to do that. I'm not willing to bet on the Kardashians and Snoop Dogg to do that. You know, if we lived in the America of Jefferson and Lincoln, maybe I would bet on secular culture entirely to carry forth these values. But we don't. Sadly, we don't live in that culture today any longer. And so it's crucial that religion, despite its problems, carry these values forward with excellence, because we may otherwise lose those values in the very time when the world needs them so badly. And with them, we can achieve moral and spiritual greatness for ourselves and for the world.
Thank you. Reverend?
First of all, I just want to comment on the composition of the panel, because I'm profoundly aware that there are 3 white Christian ladies up here. And Diana's going to have to do a lot of work in a way of bearing difference, because she knows so much about the pluralistic religious situation of America. But I do just want to say that we're all not unaware that we don't have an imam, we don't have a Buddhist, and so we're just not unaware. I think that the problem, in a way, that we all face is this longing, seeking for something to sustain us that many people express, a kind of longing for spiritual values, and yet deep skepticism about institutions, not least religious institutions. This is the age in which people don't belong to things. In my native country, England, only 6% of people go to church, despite the fact that we have a state church, an established church, or perhaps because we do. People don't really belong to political parties anymore. So there's this sense that one doesn't need to have community. But as you have heard, I grew up in community. In fact, I've always lived in community, because I've, until now, lived in university settings. So people long for that, and at the same time, they're skeptical about the institutions which could possibly bring that. And in my own world of Protestant Christianity, I understand that because ever since the Reformation, we've been kind of demanding that people sign up to a whole load of indigestible chunks of belief, what some people have called 6 impossible things before breakfast, before they could sort of belong. That's not that's not what ancient Christianity did, it's not what medieval Christianity did, but it is something that came in really with the Reformation, where different sorts of Protestant reformers, Luther, Calvin, and so on, said, this is what we stand for, this is what we stand for, we'll kill you if you don't believe it, you've got to believe it to be here, right? So I think we're still struggling a little from that Protestant inheritance that you have to believe before you can belong. And one of the things I think we need to do, and we try to do this at Grace Cathedral, is say, actually, you can belong without believing. You can belong without subscribing to all of these things. Come along and see what it's like. And I do believe very profoundly that all kinds of religious institutions must be places where we can talk about values. They must be places where people can openly explore values. And I think cathedrals have a very special role because they're these iconic and civic institutions. And since I've been at Grace Cathedral, I have discovered how so many people feel that they own the cathedral. Quite a lot of Jewish people, actually, as well, interestingly, which is wonderful. So it's a kind of this iconic institution which people feel they can come in to explore values, and they'll be given some guidance, but a great deal of intellectual openness, and I think that's one of the attractions of these kinds of places. I think the other problem is that we've sometimes preserved our traditions in aspic, but the fact is that tradition is always dynamic, and I think that's what Elaine was pointing to at the beginning. The tradition is always necessarily dynamic. We're never in the same place. And so we have to remember to sort of articulate that and illustrate and show that. Thanks.
Thank you all, and thank you, Crystal, for trying to keep us on time. So this is, I hear some things here that the potential of revising some of the stories that speak to our values. The big question is, who is the we? Is feeling Jewish enough? Is it okay to belong if you don't believe? I wanted to start with you, Diana Eck, and ask you about difference, how you think about it. You know, in a way, this sort of dynamic, even the dynamic inside of a tradition, part of the dynamic of America is difference. What have you learned in 20 years about these differences? For example, should we all be trying to look for the universal in them or not?
Well, you will eventually find things that are universal, but pluralism, which is the ethic of America, really, is based on difference. I mean, it's written into our Constitution, to the Bill of Rights, that religious freedom is a recipe for religious difference, and that's what we have. Now, the important thing is not simply the difference itself, but the fact that we need to be able to build some sort of society out of and through these differences. Not try to elide them and say, you know, we're all the same, or the melting pot is here. I mean, you know, sociologists wrote a piece in The Nation in 1915 called Democracy versus the Melting Pot. And that really set the stage here that, you know, democracy means that we have a right to our differences. If you're Muslim American, you have a right to your differences, but you don't have a right to just sort of stand in a corner and be by yourself. We need to engage those differences. And then one other thing I would say is that the differences of our religious traditions are not only embedded in communities and in individuals, they also have become part of ourselves. There is a kind of inner encounter of difference. So when you talk about a la carte religion or something like that, it's part of me that says, well, we've always done that, actually. I'm not a Christian who can go on pretending that I've never read the Bhagavad Gita and never turned to that for spiritual sustenance, or never read the teachings of Pema Chodron or Thich Nhat Hanh and find those not to be not simply out there, but spiritually nourishing.
So let me ask
the differences is within.
Let me ask a really practical question about, so I think that, for example, the notion of your project, the project you suggest we need to do, Elaine, of revising is potentially very exciting. As well, I think the project of looking at difference yet again a new way, and you've been doing that for 20 years, is exciting. But in a practical way, what do we do at the Aspen Institute when there's 4 people on the panel and an hour to talk? And look what happens. There is no Muslim, there is no Buddhist. What do we do about the way we even organize ourselves? Elaine, help me with that.
Well, that's a good question. And in fact, this discussion between Diana and then your comments and Steve, I wanted to ask you that question, Steve. You talked about the Torah as a repository of all of the values you articulated. Yes, okay. Could those values or similar values be found in the sutras?
Of course.
Well, I didn't know from what you said.
Yes, but and this is where the particular is in a sense universal. Let me just respond to the a la carte question. A point. It was not about religious traditions. It was about institutionalized religion. So, in other words, I'll rent the rabbi for this. I'll rent the priest for that. I'll rent the cathedral for my wedding. I won't be a part of the community. That was my point about the challenge we have to somehow meet is this a la carte mentality in terms of consumerism as it pertains to institutionalized religion, not as it pertains to religion itself. In fact, this difference is literally baked into Judaism by means of the Talmud, where every contrary opinion is carefully upheld and recorded. So I don't want to be misunderstood.
What is the success then of the Talmud in terms of the contrariness of it?
I think its success, number one, is that it's an honest conversation, that no one is muted, and that the desire for consensus does not trump the desire for individuality. So in that sense, I think it's also just an amazing intellectually rigorous exercise. But now, to get to these issues, it's the way I sort of explain this on a sort of grassroots level is that, to me, this is very much like falling in love with your partner or spouse. It's in its own way quite unique. It's in its own way only yours. But you also are fully aware that others have this very same relationship with his or her own spouse or partner. And so that's the way I would respond to it. The Torah is my way. It's the wisdom that I fell in love with when I was 15 years old. But it doesn't preclude others falling in love in the most delicate and beautiful way on their own. And that's the best way to think of it.
Let me ask you a real practical question. So when we think about differences, you'll walk across the street and talk to Charles Barkley and be a part of his book. But in the sermon of yours that I read, you're very concerned about Jewish assimilation going too far, and you're very concerned about interreligious marriage.
Not precisely, and this is a very important point because I'd like to stay employed. So, to be precise about that sermon that I sent you, which was about not dropping the Torah, which, by the way, my dear friend and my rabbi, Linda Resnick, helped me write.
Tell that story about dropping the Torah. That's
Okay,
a good
well,
story.
the whole sermon is predicated on when I was 8 years old, this very scary rabbi with slick back hair and crooked yellow teeth got in my face when I was 8 years old, and he said, "Stevie, I understand you're going to be holding the Torah for your cousin Marky's bar mitzvah this morning. If you drop the Torah, we all have to fast for 40 days. So, Stevie, don't drop the Torah. Let's go." I was 8 years old. So I've feared dropping the Torah my entire life ever since then. Now, the point in that sermon was not about intermarriage. The point in that sermon was that, first of all, it's none of my business who falls in love with whom, who chooses to marry whom. We all know two Jews who never should have married each other. So it's neither good nor bad that people fall in love and marry each other. The point I was making in that sermon is that Jews have a 1.3 per couple birth rate in this country, number one. And number two, 50% of Jews marry out, which is not the problem. The problem is that 75% of the 50% do not raise Jewish children because they cannot resolve the issue in their relationship. That's the problem.
Reverend Jane Shaw, chime in before I open up for, I'm serious about hearing from the audience. So what are you thinking about what we're saying so far? What do you make of this?
I'm wondering if the problem you've just articulated, Steve, is a very precisely Jewish problem. I mean, is that a fair question?
I doubt that it is a uniquely Jewish problem.
What do you think, Diana, about that?
Cross-country plane trip a few years ago, I was reading a copy of a Reformed Jewish magazine and a Muslim magazine, and they were both about intermarriage, and they both said pretty much the same thing, and there are hardly any more Episcopalians than there are Jews and Muslims too, so I don't know.
But about the other thing that's sort of going through my head as people are talking is about the question of authenticity and the ways in which I think people seek authenticity, and they frequently see the churches, religious institutions as not being the bearers of that. And that's why they want the kind of self-select spiritual life. Where does authenticity reside?
I think the question is really, I mean, can religion survive in a volitional environment?
What does that mean?
Well, in other words, will freedom do to us what our enemies never could, namely force us to disappear? Because we no longer have the kind of structure that literally forced Jews to be Jews. I mean, in the old days, the rabbis had real power.
Are you saying, can Judaism survive, or are you saying, can all religions survive?
I'm not an expert on all religions, but I suspect it's not a unique challenge to Judaism.
Elaine is dying to speak.
Elaine.
Just a comment, Steve. I mean, you talk about consumerism and cafeteria. I've heard a lot of that talk from lots of people. I don't really have a stake in religious institutions the way you do. I happen to love some of them, and some of them I don't. And it seems to me that picking and choosing what of a huge, vast, massive tradition you love and what you don't is really fundamental to what Jane's talking about, authenticity. So I think consumerism is a sort of negative way to talk about, I'm speaking of a different thing, which is about choice that you make within a tradition, if you like it. And I tend to be a heretic. I mean, the word heretic means choice. Yeah. And that's something that Christian bishops thought wasn't very good for people in their congregations.
You know, I don't think there's any question. The largest movement in Judaism is Reformed Judaism because it's predicated on the autonomy of the individual. And that's, you know, what I'm a part of. What I'm talking about, though, is to what degree are you willing to sacrifice some of that to be a part of a community?
Oh, okay, I want to hear from the audience. So I'm going to do something really unfair, Jane. And this is just because I've seen you in action, and I know that one thing you do well is to create conversation and to create communication.
The pressure's high now.
Yeah, all right.
What do you want me to do?
I would like you to pose a question to the audience.
Oh, sure. Who here would like to have spiritual values but feels they couldn't go to a religious institution for them?
Well, we need that person to not only raise their hand, but
and
be
say
willing
why.
to stand up and say why.
Why, absolutely.
Pop right up. Could we get the mic up here to this lady in the back? Her hand is quite high back there.
Hi, I love the question. My
Say
name's
who
Sue.
you are, please.
Consider myself a reluctant atheist, and I'm curious what you all think, because I think I see two things have been going on for the past year or two. One is an increasingly vocal challenge to religious belief from atheists, such as Richard Dawkins and the late Christopher Hitchens. And at the same time, we have people like Elaine who is now, he is suggesting we build temples for atheists. I think he wants to start in France. And the way I interpret that is what he sees is build in the rituals, the physical structures that keep religious communities together and convey values without the, what Christopher Hitchens would say, fairy tale nature of religion. Do you see promise in that?
Yeah. Did I say? Let me say something about that. There is promise in that because, what is theism anyway? I mean, I would have to ask every atheist, what kind of God don't you believe in? Because there are so many descriptions of what we imagine God to be. And sometimes it's sort of an 8-year-old version of God on a cloud upstairs somewhere. And I don't believe in that kind of God either. But it is true that theism is not really part of deeply religious traditions. The Buddhist tradition, many types of bodhisattvas, etc., but on the whole, one that doesn't have a theism built into it. And there's been a lot of promise in Buddhism, in its many, many streams that has, dealt with some of the deepest human questions. And those are the ones that we grapple with, suffering and growing old and dying. These are human questions. We don't need theism to answer them, but we do need a path.
What would the path look like?
Well, the path could look like any of the paths that the Buddha proposed, a path of relentless examination of one's own immediate experience, of being able somehow to bring the ever rambling mind to a certain kind of composure and stillness. And it might mean something as generous as a real sense of community. And there are atheist communities, to be sure. There's a very booming humanist chaplaincy at Harvard.
Jane, and then.
I just want to respond to the idea of the new atheists, because I think the new
Say that again, Jane.
I want to respond to the idea of this group of people called the new atheists, Richard Dawkins and co. Richard was one of my colleagues at New College for many years, so we had many conversations. And I always said you did me a favor, Richard, actually, because there's a kind of fundamentalist atheism, which I don't think you're proposing. You're saying you're a reluctant atheist, which caused all kinds of reluctant atheists and agnostics to come out of the closet, which was fabulous for us religious people because we could have a real conversation in the center, which I think has been enormously valuable. So perhaps you need those people at the fringes, such as Richard Dawkins and co., in order for those of us who actually have discovered over, say, the last decade, or however long it is since The God Delusion and those books, that we actually share rather a lot of values. And I have found that enormously helpful. And when I was, running the chapel at New College, Richard didn't very often come, but many of his atheist and agnostic colleagues and students did, because they found it was a place where they could have a conversation that they weren't able to have anywhere else on campus.
Steve.
I would say two things. You may be half right in this sense. David Brooks yesterday talked about morality having a lot to do with getting the little things right. For me, that's the mitzvot structure in Judaism, the structure of the 613 commandments in Judaism. It helps me get the little things right. And I can imagine an atheist temple where there's a number of little things that one is encouraged to get right. So in that sense, I would say yes. My gut feeling, though, is that what we really have is more of a psycholinguistic problem than a theistic problem. In this sense, my experience, this is particularly true for Jews, when they speak about God in English, they're uncomfortable because they sound like fundamentalist Christians, because they have monopolized God talk in America. And this is what I was trying to get at when I said the center and the left have to reclaim this discourse. Because once I move away from, okay, don't use the word God, tell me what you do believe in, they almost always go on to articulate a very profound theological idea, deeply rooted in any number of religious traditions. So I do believe a big part of the problem and the disconnect is psycholinguistic, not necessarily spiritual or theistic.
However, you point to something that I think is extremely important at this moment in history, which is that for those of us in the room who are not right-wing fundamentalists, it is true that they seem to own, am I right, Diana? Do they own the corner of religion? Do we think of religion in that way? Is there, many people on the left bemoan that it's difficult to find a place where we can call upon even religion as a way of organizing people and bringing people to our values.
You're sort of asking a person who has fought this battle for a long time, because I also chair the Interreligious Affairs Council of the National Council of Churches, which is the mainline churches, all of which are said to be in decline, but I don't care if they're in decline. They actually are holding a kind of strong love and justice community Christianity that is not trying to get a corner on God and saying we can circle the wagons around the one we call God, and we perfectly know who God is, what God wants, and that God is on our side, and that God is not, after all, Allah. I mean, you know, that there's just this kind of lack of any kind of theological humility amongst fundamentalist Christians. And, you know, Elaine knows perfectly well that our whole biblical tradition is a long discussion of difference.
Yeah, I mean, just a quick comment. I appreciate the honesty, and when you talk about people who are trying to be honest about what they believe. But, you know, I thought when you said that, what's wrong with fairy tales? I mean, I was trying to say that the story of the Garden of Eden, the story of creation, is not meant to be taken literally. You could take it very seriously as a story that talks about fundamental values. And it's about what Jane called the moral imagination. I think religion is all about the imagination. I kind of like the imagination. That's
But
why
maybe in the revision, there is something, just I'm thinking about, Jane, your talk yesterday morning, where you pointed out that many of Jesus's parables were situated in a kind of an agrarian culture, which is what makes it harder for us to believe those fairy tales or to belong with those fairy tales. I mean, do you think you call it, you say a linguistic problem, is there a way of enriching the imagery without, you know, in the 60s we all started singing folk songs and changing the scriptures and all of that, but, you know, is there a place to either reinvigorate the images or to, you know, or to revise them?
Does someone else want to answer this? Sorry. Are you asking me?
I'm thinking about your talk yesterday.
Yeah. Well, I always want to put scripture into dialogue with other texts, and those texts could be one of Anna's plays or a sculpture or a painting. I mean, I'm always interested, or poetry, or, you know, the story of the election or whatever it is. I mean, I think we're always...
That's our job.
That's your
That's
job.
our job,
But
But are you doing the job well enough?
Okay, of course not, because it's an impossible job to complete. But look, this is, I'm going to go back to something that I said in my opening remarks. I teach homiletics at the seminary, how to write sermons, eulogies, and wedding addresses. And I you know, I guess this is an off-the-record conversation, more or less.
Not really.
It's not. It's one of the more on-the-record conversations you're ever going to have.
Well, then I'll say it anyway. I'll say it anyway.
Okay.
This is the art of preaching. This is the art of being a religious leader, is to help each person find him or herself within this story, and to find the story within him or herself. And if you cannot do that, you ought not to be ordained. And unfortunately, we ordain class after class after class of people who simply are not very good at it.
Well, could I add a little word to that? Because I spent the first 2 weeks of this summer dealing with candidates for Christian ministry.
It's no better, is it?
Well, it is no better in one way. I do want them to know their story. I want them to know that there's not one story of Jesus, but there are 4 or more in the Gospels, that they didn't sort of meld them all into one and create the strong man Jesus. But I also want them to know that whatever ministry you have, it will always, from now on, be in a multi-religious society. So these ministerial students went with me and my colleague to the mosque, where we spent a whole day, to the Hindu temple, where we saw the Abhisheka of Vishnu, who's being anointed and lustrated with yogurt and milk and orange juice, and figuring out what's going on there. And we were in Buddhist temples and in the Sikh community, where we were received with enormous hospitality and with langar, so that in telling the story of their community, they know that they and everyone in their congregation will live in a community that includes people who are not like themselves. And I love, Rabbi Sachs from England, The Dignity of Difference, a book that he wrote and that I've assigned to students over and over.
I'll tell you one of them.
I'm going to go back out. Taylor Branch. To what extent do sports help us with a sense of difference? And to what extent do they not? And I'm asking you this not only as a guy who would like to ask some questions about sports and college sports in particular, which are the gospel in places like University of Texas, Austin, and many others, but also as a civil rights historian.
Okay, sports, that's our religion.
The easiest way for me to look at it is that it's sadly backwards, that sports teaches us to worship athletes but not to respect them as fellow human beings, which is just the opposite of what religion should do in its best sense. So that, in my view, is the doorway to a lot of the stuff that's done wrong with sports. The term fanatic and fan and everything, we want to boo them and cheer them, but we don't consider them fellow human beings. And in that sense, that's what religion is trying to, the best religion should be trying to get us away from.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Anybody want to talk? Anybody, just put your hand right up. Yes.
Do we expect more from...
Say who you are, and we're going to give you a mic.
Mike.
I'm Dorothy Austin. I'm wondering, do we expect more from religious organizations than others? I think when we're disappointed by our church or our temple or our mosque, it's pretty bad. So we fall in love with a tradition, but we also have divorces sometimes. And for real reasons, because a lot of failure has been in evidence of late in our religious communities. And I think we have to say something about that. And I hope the panel will address it.
Anybody want to take that on? Well,
Failure, I mean, this is religion's middle name in the United States. I mean, scandal after scandal. I mean, it's really just last week that we, for the first time, had any official in the Roman Catholic Church who was actually convicted on any kind of child endangerment. Time after time, there are, you know, what is lifted up in the press are the things that are.
but other institutions, lots of other institutions are full of scandals as well.
Yeah, a lot of institutions, but I think it's right. When our religious institutions break into scandal, we feel particularly betrayed.
Something else from out there.
David wasn't perfect.
Who said that?
Talk about scandals.
David was
wasn't
not perfect. That's right.
But
I don't
I
think
could just-
people expect perfection. I think they have different unrealistic expectations of religious institutions as in terms vis-a-vis their unrealistic expectations of their bank or their doctor or their car that they drive. So I think we're full of unrealistic expectations, and sometimes we can manage those and sometimes we can't. I sometimes have to meet with people and say, I'm sorry, we're just not the right congregation for you. You know, there's the door. And other times I say, you're right, our mistake, it's my job to make sure this never happens again, and thank you. And, you know, it's a very situationally based, and I also think the big problem, this is what I call alignment. I think what you're really alluding to is when the religious leader is what I would call out of alignment. When one's publicly professed values and one's privately lived values are not in alignment, that's when people are deeply disappointed. And that's when they have every right to be deeply disappointed.
Jane?
Well, that just brings me back to the word I used earlier, which is people want authenticity, and I think they want that most of all from religious institutions. Right. And when they don't have it, that's a problem. But I also think that we fail quite often as religious institutions in keeping the conversation going, in actually talking about forgiveness and healing. You know, we're just as flawed as everyone else. We're just weak human beings, really. We try, but
Okay, where? Who? Yes,
Hi.
good.
Hi, Anna.
Hi.
I want to,
Mr.
Joe
Klein.
Klein, yes. I want to read the words of the first Jewish convert. I'll read it from the King James edition of the Bible because I like the poetry better. And Ruth said, "Entreat me not to leave thee, or to return from following after thee. For whither thou goest, I will go, and where thou lodgest, I will lodge. Thy people shall be my people, and thy God my God." Now, I don't sense I'm a Jew. I know I'm a Jew. When I say the prayers in a synagogue, I feel deeply rooted to 5,000 years of tradition, a moral tradition that gave us Western civilization. But I gotta say, I'm not a member of a synagogue, because the rabbi who taught me the beauty of those words gave a Kol Nidre sermon. Kol Nidre is the holiest night of the
It's
year.
the Super Bowl of services.
Right. He gave a Kol Nidre sermon against intermarriage, where I had a Jewish friend and his Catholic wife sitting next to me. And it seems to me that the thing that we're eliding here in this whole discussion is that for far too many religions, the most important things are thou shalt not, and you are not. And you said my way, Rabbi, before, my way or the highway. You know, for me, if Judaism can't survive on the basis of our prayers and our values after 5,000 years of civilization, then we don't deserve to.
I agree.
I'm not at all concerned about assimilation. What I worry about is that the exclusivity of the blood has robbed Judaism of a great deal of moral strength.
Well, I would respond by saying, first of all, I cannot think of a single time in Judaism when that exclusivity has actually existed. You know that in the biblical period, all the patriarchs had several wives, and many of them not Israelites or Hebrews, because identity was determined by the father. So we were always a matrilineal and patrilineal people. And I don't think there's ever been, by the way, we were having lunch with my new friends from Miami, and we were talking about the intermarriage rate during the colonial period was 35%. Read Jonathan Sarna. Intermarriage is not a problem. In fact, in the Enlightenment period, Abraham Geiger argued that you cannot be a light unto the nations if you're not among the nations. We're developing a downtown campus in Los Angeles because it's the only Jewish institution in Los Angeles where other kinds of people live, that's not in the ghetto. I couldn't agree with you more. And if we can't survive on what and who we are, then we should go the way of the Phoenicians. And that's right. My point is that you have gone far beyond feelings. You have a set of prescribed behaviors that create those feelings in you. And my concern is that without that prescribed set of behaviors, the feelings eventually too will disappear. Now your point is, well, maybe they should if people aren't willing to engage in these behaviors. And that's the question. And you know, I won't walk you through the whole conversation, but there's a very famous essay called The Ever-Dying People, which is about the Jews. And the basic point is that the reason we never die is because every generation of Jews is convinced it's going to be the last. So I think there's something healthy in that dynamic. But intermarriage is a tremendous plus for Judaism if we embrace it appropriately.
Elaine, I was hoping, I pick up on something that Joe Klein said also about thou shalt not. And I was wondering, as a historian, if you could tell us something about thou shalt not, and what good it's done, what bad it's done, and how we think about the thou shalt not inside of religion. It makes me think again, Jane, about your talk yesterday where you have a discomfort with the notion of being commanded to love.
Yes.
Right?
Well, there are many ways to think about that, Anna. You know, I'm thinking about the history of Christian tradition, and one of the ways it survived politically and socially was by being exclusive and claiming to be the only true religion. That's a view I don't hold at all. I think it's been a useful one, pragmatically, but I don't think it's true. And That's what I mean by revising.
But how do we revise thou shalt not, for example?
You mean moral commandments?
Yeah.
Well,
Or rules inside of religions that could have had a reason in the past that get in our way now. You've alluded to some
we do.
of it.
I mean, we have to in some ways, because I was talking about the Adam and Eve story and the
Yes.
sexual attitudes expressed there. They come out of thousands of years ago. They come out of situations and cultures into a world of the 21st century which is unimaginable to the people who wrote and told those stories. That doesn't mean that we necessarily throw away the story.
But
I
they
happen
can
to
be tricky. I just wanted to give one brief example. When I was working as a theological consultant for the House of Bishops in England, I was staggered when this rather conservative bishop was making some argument for heterosexual marriage to be the only form of marriage. He said, and it's all about complementarity. You know, I just imagine Adam and Eve sitting across from each other at the fireplace. And I was like, that's a totally 19th century idea of marriage. So there is this problem of kind of glomming, you know, our contemporary ideas back onto ancient texts.
Yes. And
What's
I was
wrong
thinking,
with saying this may have been wise in and of its own day, but it is clearly wrong, and we no longer subscribe to it? What is the problem with that? The Torah says slavery is okay. It's not. The Torah says concubinage is okay, which is a fancy word for you know what. It's not. The Torah says homosexuals should be stoned to death at the gates. They should not. What's wrong with simply saying in some ways the Torah, the Gita, the New Testament is simply no longer correct?
Well, this is a wonderful thought, because that actually gets to the role of Scripture, or whatever you call Scripture.
It's a dynamic
in our
tradition.
traditions. I mean, a lot of Christians I know think that these several verses that they fling in the faces of gays and lesbians, or the ones that they say prove that it's only our way that's truth. I mean, they're almost like Chinese fortune cookies. They have 3 or 4 of them that they carry around as if this were the whole Bible, and they don't look at the rest of the Levitical codes or the rest of the Gospel of love. They don't look at any of the rest of it.
well, that's why I think all of these traditions, I mean, they're very ancient. You got to look at them with that perspective. I was thinking of Rick Santorum talking about, you know, the biblical view of marriage as one man, one woman. Well, it wasn't, of course. It was one man and as many women as he could afford.
So we have 30 seconds. The man in purple, all the way in the back, will you say something?
Thank you very much for a great conversation. One of the ways, so I grew up Catholic, attending Catholic church in a Southern Baptist school. And one of the things that's curious about this conversation, dissonant from my religious education, is that the focus, in many ways, one of the primary focuses of my education in church and in chapel was on the afterlife. And we haven't discussed it much on stage, but I'm curious, both as historians and as religious thinkers, what do you think? Has there been an increased emphasis on the afterlife in religion? Are we in a moment where there is a sort of waxing emphasis?
Well, let me just say one quick thing that I think is related to something that came up over and over again yesterday in the magnificent panel in this room about the Supreme Court decision. And without a doubt, everyone talked about the need for us as Americans to deal with death in ways, because it is an economic issue in terms of what's going to happen, and it's inevitable. And one of the things that's interesting to me is that science knows very little about before life and nothing about afterlife. I had a conversation with Francis Collins about this. We have fights, political fights about before life and afterlife. And maybe that is a realm where religion particularly has had a lot to say, because it's one of the still remaining mysteries in a world of diminishing ones. Does anybody want to?
Well, it always...
Put my question succinctly. Do you think that religion emphasizes today more how we die than how we should live?
How we die or the afterlife? They're two very different things.
What happens when we die?
What happens after death?
Yeah.
I don't think many religions, I don't know, the liberal Protestant mainline denominations that I represent don't talk about that very much at all.
Well, there are a lot of them that were mainly concerned about whether you're going to hell or not, and I say that on behalf of some of the more fundamentalist Christians. There are a lot of them, that's what they talk about. I'm not at all interested in that realm. I'm more interested in how we live.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us for this conversation.